Hello world, Kala with A64. Well, I say it's time we finally settle this. What gets you more FPS in CS2? Windows or Linux? We all know that all the pros play on Windows and all the big tournaments are played on Windows, but why was the Linux version of the game forsaken? We're here to help answer these questions, and even if the results might seem predictable, we will also explain and speculate onto what led to our conclusions. First things first, I have a few things to address regarding OS trends and also technicalities in regards to our test bench and methodology in order to be fully transparent as to how the numbers were achieved. Let us start with a summary of why all pro players and tournaments are on Windows. The most obvious reason is the Nvidia driver situation that until very recently was there on the Linux side, but it has gotten better in recent time. Another reason is HID, as in human interface device support, because very few peripherals manufacturers that require third-party applications to function provide these applications for Linux. Third-party anti-cheat support is also a major Linux deterrent for obvious reasons, and all of these put together result in non-existing adoption. In this video I will also point out some other major reasons Linux is to be avoided for now, but also the advantages that it brings. Okay, let's move on to our test bench, and I want to say that I am aware that the hardware we will be testing on is not at all reminiscent to what anyone plays CS2 on in 26, and obviously a X3D with Blackwell graphics would constitute a better performance difference indicator between Windows and Linux in the current context, so feel free to take the results with a grain of salt and use this information to build your own opinion on the matter. Right, back to it. The test bench is the system that we run for the R6 cores enough in 2025 video, minus the GPU, so check out that video to learn more about it. We are running a mild overclock for the CPU and RAM, and I'll talk more about the GPU later on. One more disclaimer, the Windows we will conduct testing on isn't really your typical Windows. We wanted to give Windows a best case scenario, or a fighting chance to put it better, so we are using the in-house 1GB Windows as in Windows 11 that idles at 1GB of RAM. Please check out the Windows 11 on a diet video to learn more about what was kept and what was cut down from the stock variant. The build version is 26200.7705, so from January 26. I know it's not the latest version, but there shouldn't be any differences in performance from this regard. Whilst on the topic of Windows, I would really like to know what version TOs use. I know CS still runs on Windows 10 also, but I'd be interested to know if they use custom images perhaps, and what is cut if so. I'd be really surprised if they just use stock, but they're really hush-hush about it. It'd be really cool to know what's the formula for the best performance is all I'm saying. Finally, this video does not include a stock Windows benchmark because frankly I have no respect for the version of Windows that Microsoft provides. It's bloated to the point that the OS aspect gets drowned out in a sea of trash, so if you are looking for that kind of benchmark, this video is not it. Okay, before we get into benchmarking, the map used is CS2 FPS benchmark Dust2 by Frequency CS and Angel, and we'll be taking the best of 3 runs, so the system is warmed up for the following configurations: 720 by 400 with everything on minimum and no Fidelity FX super resolution, and 1920 by 1080 with the following settings: 2x MSAA, very high shadows, all dynamic shadows, low textures, 4x anisotropic, high shader, low particles, high ambient occlusion, and quality HDR, also without FSR. As we are about to head into Windows benchmarking, let me tell you about the GPU we are running. It's an Asus Radeon 260X 2GB version I have to mention because there was also a 1GB variant, so Volcanic Islands Bonaire XTX, so the best iteration of Bonaire, graphics core Next 2.0 or 1.1, and we are running the fabulous RID 23.9.3 2109 legacy GCN drivers from March 25 alongside a mild overclock. Now for the overclock, this particular Asus came downclocked from factory running 1075 instead of 1100 for core and 1250 instead of 1625 for memory. We managed to clock the core at 1155 and the memory at 1600 with a minimal core undervolt consisting of the following p-state drops: 0, 0, -2, -5, -10, -15, -18 and -24 mV, and also a 20% increase of the stock power limit. I also want to mention that we are running CS2 on the stock DirectX 11 API here on Windows. With that said, let's tackle the benchmarks. We'll start with low settings, and what we can see straight off the bat is that the GPU utilization does sometimes drop alongside the core clock, and miraculously CS2 on the lowest of settings does not bounce off our 2GB RAM limit, staying just 200 MB under it. Also, the CPU utilization and consumption is higher than what you will see on the high settings because it has to keep up with more frames per second. On the topic of frames, we can see stellar frame times, which was to be expected considering we still have some GPU overhead somehow somehow. And finally, the DRAM amount the system is consuming is around 6.8 GB, which would be more like 6.5, 6.6 without monitoring. Also, the numbers you see in the bottom left corner are taken without monitoring, so a little higher than the run display right now. This will go for all benchmarks. Talking about it, 253 average and 124 1% lows are obviously stellar results out of the hardware, but obviously no one is playing 700 by 400. This is more to see what happens when the GPU bottleneck gets removed and how or if there is any difference between CPU performance across Windows and Linux. Moving on to the other set of settings, now we can finally see the GPU pretty much staying at 100% load and the VRAM limit being exceeded, thus also increasing the DRAM consumption just above 8 GB, and I'm assuming that without monitoring you can still fit high setting CS2 on a 8 GB system, even if you are facing a worst case scenario like this one where your GPU only has 2 GB of VRAM. As I said, the CPU utilization has dropped to under half of what it was on the lowest settings, and another interesting indicator here is the frame time graph, where we can occasionally see those waves, not really spikes, that I think are generated because of texture and effect streaming to the GPU getting bottlenecked by its minuscule memory bus and bandwidth, obviously paired with the fact that a lot of information gets offloaded or paged to system DRAM, so this is a really good showing of how the pros call it VRAM overflow. This graphics configuration was obviously tested in order to see the difference between the GPU driver here on Windows and the one Linux has to offer. Finally, let's talk about actual performance. 55 FPS on average with 20.8 FPS 1% lows on these settings in CS2 are unexpected. This is way higher than I thought the 260X could achieve, and considering I did Windows benchmarking before Linux, I really believe that there is no way you can get better performance out of this hardware, but let's find out together as we move on to Linux. Bazzite is the de facto Linux gaming distro based on Fedora. Alongside CatchOS and a few others, they stand at the vanguard of the new age Linux gaming distros that have been set to rival and have potential to overthrow Windows in terms of gaming. However, seeing that we've been stuck in the era of the Linux for the past 5 or more years, we can say that at least for now Microsoft still boasts the undisputed majority of the vast PC gaming user base. So let's find out if that's warranted or not. First of all, this is the Bazzite version we're using, and these are the GPU drivers. Thanks Valve.
Wait, is that Gabe?
Come on, not every dude with a beard.
Hi, this is Gabe.
Oh.
Because AMD does not provide official legacy drivers. Now, GPU overclocking on Linux. Oh boy. In order to be fully clear here, before I show you the actual overclock and driver limitations, I want to say that from this point of view, yeah, the testing might not seem correct, might not seem objective. However, I want to remind you that here we are testing OSs, so if the driver on Windows allows me to have higher clocks than the one here on Linux, I'm going to give that to Windows as being superior in terms of performance, because if you want to purely find out what OS is best, you have to acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses of the contenders and not arbitrarily limit the performance of one to match the other, when it can obviously surpass it. Alright, so with that said, let's get on to GPU overclocking on Linux. You want to go to sys, class, DRM, card1, device, and here you will find all that you need basically. Starting with core, your states are stored in PowerPlay DPM serial clock, and you can overclock by modifying the value inside PowerPlay SCLK OD. Here the value represents a percentage and is limited to 20. The same goes for memory, but replace SCLK with MCLK, and here is the first limiting factor of the Linux drivers. Since we are limited to 20% increase, we cannot go to 1.6 GHz, instead we are stuck at 1.5. Now this would not have been an issue, since I thought you could easily edit the PowerPlay table and de-restrict the OD values. However, I haven't found the PowerPlay editor that supports GCN 1.1/2, so we're stuck at 1.5. The next issue that we're facing is voltage state control. The driver simply does not provide what should be PowerPlay OD CLK voltage, so we have no interface for voltage control, unfortunately. Another issue is the power limit that is set in stone at 105 watts, so yeah. The final thing that we can do is fan control via hardware-mon 1. So that was underwhelming. It's crazy to see that Linux has more safeguards than Windows, and that's a sentence I can't believe I'm saying. I'm sure some basement dweller in Shenzhen unlocked overclocking for this card 10 years ago, but I'm not bothering for this video. Also, I guess fuck you if you don't write your own GPU drivers, so yeah, skill issue for me. Overall, I quite like the CLI overclocking and interface here on Linux. The only thing, apart from limited control, I think is missing is granularity, as in OD values should accept decimal point in my opinion, but yeah, I thoroughly recommend you do your own reading of the driver documentation, as there is quite a lot to cover inside a single video. Before we move on to the actual benchmark, I want to address the idle RAM consumption of Bazzite, which I know is not a good indicator of performance, but but I still think it's interesting to compare between OSs. This value was around 2.3 GB, which is a value. I expected quite a bit less, but here we are. I have to mention that CS2 runs Vulkan here on Linux, unlike DX11 on Windows. On to the benchmarks finally, starting with the lowest settings. The stuttering you're seeing is caused by the monitoring overlay, and I'll remind you that the values taken are without monitoring, and the game does not stutter when we remove Mango HUD. This is just how it goes. I will now switch to a recording taken without Mango HUD and go from there. So there are a few things I'd like to discuss. First, unlike Windows, where these exact settings fit inside the card's 2 GB VRAM limit, on Linux it tops and overflows into the system RAM for some reason. Also, the GPU is constantly at 100%, whereas on Windows it mostly stayed under that, showing the massive driver or API overhead difference between Windows and Linux. CPU utilization is about the same, so no comment there. And finally, the worst offender is system DRAM consumption. We can see a 2 GB jump from 6.8 to 8.7 GB in game, so that's about a 30% increase, which is not good. Finally, the system cleared the map at 217.7 FPS average and 122 FPS 1% lows. Now, these numbers are awfully close to what we got on Windows, and I think that if we had access to the proper GPU-C, bazzite would have cleared 1% lows and maybe matched average in this scenario, where a lot of heavy lifting is also done by CPU due to the superior Linux scheduler and less low store memory addressing, so credit where is due. Coming on to the high settings, nothing really changes apart from CPU utilization dropping, which was expected, and DRAM consumption jumping by half a gig up to 9.2. Here, where the bottleneck is clearly the GPU, the Linux drivers simply cannot keep up with what we had on Windows, and I don't think any amount of overclocking is moving the 28.4 frames anywhere close to the 55 we got on Windows. 1% lows were close, and maybe you could argue that with proper OC it might have matched Windows, but I doubt it. So that was bazzite. Now I want to move on to something proper light, that being artix, based on Art. Here is the version, GPU driver and overclock that is identical to what we ran on bazzite. The idle RAM consumption is under 700 MB, which is stellar, and it's time to move on to the low settings benchmark. Overall, behavior was identical to what we saw on bazzite with less system RAM consumption, however it returned just 136.6 FPS average and 86.7 FPS 1% lows, so clearly gaming flavor Linux does indeed boost gaming performance to no one's surprise. High settings, again identical behavior to that of bazzite with less DRAM consumption and a lower FPS return, albeit this time the difference between the two Linux distros was smaller, 22.5 average FPS and 14.1 FPS 1% lows. Finally, before we move on to conclusions, I want to address the difference between average and 1% returns across all configurations. Here we can see that artix wins stability by a considerable margin, offering the lowest variance in FPS returns, and I must say that it was more than definitely noticeable in game. Even though it scored the least FPS, it was the smoothest. Following, not far behind, is bazzite, again offering a smooth experience, and lastly Windows. That was definitely the choppiest, if you can call it that, because it was still pretty smooth, and I would definitely prefer to play on Windows despite it losing in this metric. So what can we take away from this video? First, the 1 GB Windows 11 offers stellar performance. The RID third-party drivers also offer amazing performance. Overclocking on Windows is the best bar none, and I think that the numbers we saw for the Windows benchmark prove that this is the best formula for getting the utmost performance out of this hardware. Second, AMD GPU Linux drivers are massively lacking in terms of performance as well as overclocking capabilities. The Linux scheduler and CPU calls performance is more sophisticated and vastly more performant than what Windows offers. And finally, all of this doesn't matter. Feel free to run the OS of your choice, as they are all rubbish anyways. Well, you made it to the end. Who would have thought that Windows beats the 70s mainframe in gaming, huh? I personally was sad to see it. Hopefully, if SteamOS ever gets an official desktop release, it will perform much better than what we saw here and today, but until then we're stuck with what we have. Most importantly, do your own investigation, don't take this video as the be-all and end-all of OS performance metrics, read the docs for yourself, and I guess we should all start writing Linux GPU drivers. Thanks for watching!